A very warm welcome to everybody for tonight's lecture with Professor Jean Williams. My name is Paula Harrison and I'm coordinator at University Centre Telford. We are part of the University of Wolverhampton, and as the name suggests, we're based in Telford, right in the heart of the town, in the South Water building. Now normally we would run a public lecture programme in our centre to engage with people in Telford, Shropshire and the wider area. But unfortunately, obviously, because of the current situation, we can't do that. So we've moved all of our lectures online. And tonight's lecture is the 5th in our series. So far they've all been on sport, but we have got some other subject areas coming up. And we're delighted tonight to welcome Professor Jean Williams from the sports team for her lecture on sport in a time of crisis. Now, before I hand you over to Jean, just a couple of technical things to point out. If you're on a laptop or a desktop, the question and answer icon is in the middle of your screen at the bottom. So Jean will take questions, so if you post them there and I can see them and then I'll read them out to Jean. If you're on a mobile device, the Q&A icon is in the top right hand corner. Now, I don't think I can unmute you, but I think you can unmute yourselves. So if at any point you want to chat with Jean and interact, if she's asking questions, obviously you can do that. That would be great. So I'd like to welcome Professor Jean Williams for tonight's lecture. She is Professor of Sport at the University of Wolverhampton, and she writes about the cultural history of sport. Her areas of expertise are football history and culture, women's sport and gender history, sport and literature, cultural histories of sport, including clothing, posters, and the marketing of sport, and the Olympic Games. So we're delighted to welcome Jean tonight, and we hope that you enjoy her lecture. Thank you very much, Jean.
Thank you, Paula. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. I recognise, particularly with the opening up of retail, that had this lecture been a few weeks ago, then you might have had fewer other things to do with your time than to attend. So I really am grateful for people who have joined us this evening. And this is going to be a lecture really of two halves. It's going to be historical in the first element, recognising that there is a historical contribution to the curriculum at Wolverhampton, but also our students are very often interested. When I teach the Olympic Games on modules, then it's usually as part of a mega events module. So students are more interested usually in the contemporary aspects of sport and what it might mean. And of course, the big question that we're asking ourselves at the current time is what sport is going to look like when we get out of the current situation. So I'm guessing that people will want to talk to that. Nevertheless, there are some historical themes, mainly because point one of the historical aspects, this year we've experienced virtually all sport abruptly stop at all levels across the globe. It feels unprecedented, but in fact we've had crises like this before, and what can we learn from those crises? So I'm going to focus particularly on the case of football during World War I and contrast it with the Olympic Games in 1936 and 1948. Then the second theme I'm going to speak about is what role can sport play, what's left of it at times of crisis like these, and historically what role has it played. We live in a much more connected world now with social media and so forth, as Marcus Rashford has brilliantly shown over the last few days. What an amazing young man he is for 22, and his use of his platform to change things, particularly in the context of Black Lives Matter. So how does this more connected world impact on global sport in terms of the way this particular pandemic is hitting sports relationship with spectators? We could talk about, you know, the horse racing, and we could talk about the Liverpool Champions League games and whether those sorts of things should have gone on, the horse racing at Cheltenham. There are some sports that are crucially important. For instance, the Premiership, football and its fan base. So it's not just about big events like the Olympics and Wimbledon, and it's not just about these big sports. What's the impact on sports with less global fan base, the ones that aren't big business? And I'm thinking increasingly of, you know, your little local swimming club and your little local bowls club. What's the effect of the hiatus been on those community sport? This all understandably feels a bit gloomy for the future, but there are unexpected upsides to this pandemic on sport, and can our relationship with physical activity change as a result of what's happened? And one of the things I'll be interested to learn in the Q&A session is whether you're somebody who's taken up a new fitness regime or set yourself new goals as part of the pandemic, and our commitment to increasing our own health. Before we come to that though, I hope to speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then I'd like to open up to conversations. So here we go then. Ref has blown his whistle. First half, the historical aspects. Football at home in World War I is the first thing that I want to speak about. So on the home front, although the Football League continued initially in 1914 as it was a professional business, this slightly tarnished the reputation of the sport, since wholly amateur sports like the Rugby Football Union in 1914 were able to suspend activity immediately. And I just want to clarify some terms here, because it's something that some people get confused about. So the Football Association, the overall governing body of football in England, was formed in 1863, mainly as a group of upper class amateurs. However, by 1885, the Football Association had to admit that a lot of the clubs who were doing very well in national football competitions, such as the FA Cup launched in 1872, were using professionals. And so by 1885, the FA had to accept professionalism. And in 1888, the Football League was established as, if you like, the Premiership of its day. So these were the leading professional football clubs that ran across two divisions with promotion and relegation and all of the things that we expect today. Organised by a group of northern businessmen, the Football League was always professional. And that differed very much from what I've just spoken about, the Rugby Football Union, which anybody who's played Rugby Football Union will know was an amateur code right until the end of the 20th century. Very distinct again from the Rugby Football League, which was professional. So going back to World War I, the Rugby Football League slightly tarnished the reputation of football. And there was even an FA Cup final in April 1915, which was called the Khaki Cup final. But football grounds were also used to recruit young men. And this was part of the way of recouping that slightly tarnished image. There were fighting units known as footballers' battalions. And after the initial suspension of the Football League, regionalised men's football continued to keep up the morale of the population in the UK. And this is one of the things that we've seen in the current pandemic, is that it was thought important to keep up people's morale, to entertain people, to give people a certain feeling of normality by having regional professional football take place during World War I. And those of you who've maybe been drawn to new sports and pastimes that have happened during the pandemic. Maybe you've suddenly taken interest in tennis, or maybe you've never thought of joining your local golf course before. We can see some of the same effects happening. Women's football also took centre stage as women moved into traditionally male roles in munitions factories, on the land and in communications and driving work. Most matches, women's matches, were played on large grounds, raised money for local charities and often for those involving wounded soldiers, and hence was a kind of double war work. Instead of resting from the dirty, dangerous, difficult jobs that they were doing, women volunteered their leisure to raise money for charity, very often mental health charities, and this continued with increasingly large crowds until 1921, when the FA issued a ruling that women could not play on grounds affiliated to it, and that it considered football an unsuitable game for women. Now, this always strikes me as particularly spiteful, because if women were willing, a woman's lot, if you're a working class woman before World War I, your life was pretty much the maids of Downton Abbey. So you would often live in and work in as a maid for someone, and you didn't have much of your own leisure time. So once these war jobs were open to young women, they absolutely flocked to the munitions factories, even though quite a few of them were blown up and died and got illnesses and injuries and all the rest of it, because it gave them better paid work and access to leisure outside the home. It always strikes me that that was particularly generous of them to then give up that leisure time to raise money for charity, and for that to be rewarded with an effective ban on women's football in 1921, from which it has never recovered, always strikes me as particularly spiteful. I think you will find it even more spiteful when you hear that the ban ran until 1969. And I can provide lecture notes with links where you might follow this up if you're interested in the story. So when the Football League returned in the 1920-21 season, it expanded from 2 divisions to a 3rd Division North and a 3rd Division South, becoming most people's experience of top-level football. There are also many games for the family, such as the one that's featured on the slide here, which featured a part of trench warfare, which leads me on to football at the front in World War I. So young men and women and families could learn about trench warfare through games such as this, that were sold widely as parlour games to be played at home. And again, very interesting collections. If you're interested in this kind of cultural history, I'd really encourage you to visit the collections of the V&A Museum of Childhood in Bethnal Green in London. Football at the front in World War I then. If any of you have seen Blackadder and you have that image of them going over the top and a football being kicked, that was the case. But I want to address some of the myths around football at the front in World War I. Soldiers, sailors and aircrew often wanted to play football to remind themselves of normality and as a way of passing the time. There are many poignant letters to professional clubs from soldiers up at the National Football Museum in Manchester. And what these soldiers were asking for were second-hand pairs of boots, a football and a pack of cigarettes. Boots and footballs would have been relatively expensive items of kit, and professional clubs had spares, but often only met the requests of men fighting on the front lines, not for those behind, who were often just sent the cigarettes. Obviously of dubious benefit to their health, but I don't suppose they were thinking of their long-term health at that time. It nevertheless seems very harsh, given that most young men who served would not see their 21st birthday. And of course, there were matches on Christmas Day, when a truce was called between German and British soldiers. And we call this the proletarianisation of football, because the officer class thought that the men would want to rest when not fighting, but soldiers enjoyed a game of football like back at home with their friends. The officers agreed because it kept the men fit, helped with mental health, and distracted them from combat roles when resting. And again, I would encourage you to go to the collections at the Imperial War Museum in London, who have great online information about this period. I also thought it important in the middle of the Black Lives Matter movement that we're currently experiencing to take a moment to highlight the career of Walter Tull. Sorry, I should have skipped forward. Just an image of frontline fighting. Walter Tull, who was an important black pioneer here in the context of Black Lives Matter. He could not have had a more difficult start in life. And I think, again, you know, parallels with some of the things that Marcus Rashford has described really resonate with this story. He was born in Folkestone in 1888. His father was Barbadian and his mother was white British. His parents both died when he was 9, and he was brought up in an orphanage with his brother in Bethnal Green, London. Aged 20, he signed for Clapham Football Club, and then the following year by Tottenham Hotspur FC. There had been other black and mixed heritage professional players, I should say. Some of these of Anglo-Indian descent, so he was by no means the first. And there had also been Walter Tull and Andrew Watson, who were from Black Caribbean backgrounds. Tull moved to Northampton Town FC in 1911, where he played half-back. And again, if you're interested in the cultural history of football, there's a statue of him at Northampton Town, and there's a wonderful statue of Arthur Wharton at the FA's St George's Park. Tull served in both football battalions of the Middlesex Regiment, and despite army rules which forbade a person of colour from being commissioned as an officer, Walter was promoted to lieutenant after officer training in Scotland in 1917. So he's widely considered to be the first African Caribbean mixed heritage man to be commissioned as an infantry officer in the British Army. Sadly, he died before his 30th birthday while leading the attack on the Western Front during the Second Battle of the Somme in March 1918. And again, if you go to the National Archives, and I can provide lecture notes with a link, there's much more information about him there. Those other football players killed in action include Bradford Park Avenue's Donald Bell, the only professional footballer to be awarded the Victoria Cross. And there's more information on him at the National Archives. So thinking about that and moving on to the Olympic Games then in 1936. The picture on the left with obviously the Nazi salute indicates the atmosphere of the Berlin Olympic Games in 1936. Now, Berlin had been awarded the Olympic Games well before Hitler came to power. And as a vegetarian hiker, it has to be said that Hitler was not terribly interested in sport and didn't particularly like games. But his chief of propaganda understood the potential forces for an Olympic Games as a platform for Nazi propaganda. And the thing that I think it's significant to understand about the 1936 Olympic Games is that the previous Games had been held in Los Angeles in 1932. And that is what we call the beginning of the Disneyfication of the Olympic Games. So Walt Disney was still very much around and used the full force of the Hollywood film industry to stage those 32 Los Angeles Olympics. In that context, Hitler wanted to use some of those same techniques for the propaganda of the Nazi regime. Well, his organisers around him did anyway. He rather reluctantly came around to the idea rather late in the game. And one of the things that's significant here is that a lot of the things that you would take for granted if you don't study the Olympic Games were invented by the Nazis. They're invented traditions, we call them, to try to give credibility to that regime. So the idea then of a torch relay directly from Greece, where there were pan-Hellenic precedents, you know, you can think of the very classical profiles of Greece, which very much fit with the Aryan ideals of the Nazi regime. So the idea of a torch relay using the latest technology to keep that torch, this is in 1936, keep that torch lit all the way from Athens to Berlin across land and sea, is an invented tradition to say to the world that the Nazi regime is directly linked to the classical ideals of Greece. Furthermore, there was a woman commissioned called Leni Riefenstahl, and she does this very long film. There's rolls and rolls of it. Believe me, I've taught this film and students often will be known to fall asleep. Even more than in my normal lectures, because there are just rolls and rolls of Olympia. And again, if you're interested in this, I would encourage you to look at it. So just look at the staging of it, the classical ideals linked with the stadium. There were you know, statues in relief. There was huge use of marble. There was huge use of foliage that referenced Greece. Everything was kind of to promote that regime. And the main threat that Hitler had in 36 is if the Americans and the English, or the British, forgive me, I know in the heart may not forgive me, the British, if the British and the Americans had stayed away, then it wouldn't have been successful. But Avery Brundage, who was head of the US Olympic Committee, was himself not exactly as far right as Hitler, but he wasn't far behind. And so the Americans went, they did a tour and were convinced that no Jewish people were going to be harmed or experience any kind of discrimination during the 36 Olympics, because of course for the length of the visit, there were no problems, and the British and the Americans didn't stay away. We went and we were part of the staging of that. The photograph on the right, I just want to highlight the woman who is on the right and whose tracksuit top says Britain. Sorry, I've just realised a typo there. That should be 1948, not 1048. Is Dorothy Tyler Odom. She goes to Berlin in 36. It's the first time she's ever been out of Britain, as a 16-year-old young woman who takes part in the high jump. She wins a silver medal, doing a scissor kick, jumping over basically a bamboo pole into sand. And there's then a hiatus of 12 years. So thinking about how we've all struggled with lockdown, what I've already indicated is that football, there was a hiatus of top flight football during World War I of 7 years, and a hiatus in the Olympic Games of 12 years. So very, very different times. Good news though, Dorothy Tyler Odom comes back in 1948 as a married 32-year-old mother of two, and defends her silver medal. So that tells you a lot about how she had to train as an amateur during the Second World War in order to be able to do that, and what a really committed performer she was. Tells us a lot, I think, about resilience during a time of crisis. So, going to start to think about some of the more contemporary aspects then of moving to the second half and hopefully pick up a little bit of speed. So this isn't even the first modern pandemic that sport has had to deal with. We had SARS earlier this century, But what happened and what did we learn? Well, SARS had a real impact on the Women's World Cup of 2003 and the Rio Olympics of 2016 were also surrounded by fears of the Zika virus epidemic. Women's World Cup was due to take place in 2003 in China, and it had to be relocated rather hastily back to Los Angeles, where it had already taken place in 1999. One of the things that this tells us, especially the Zika virus, is it's not just the virus itself, but the fear of the virus that future events will have to consider and how to manage large crowds. And I suppose some of you have been considering whether you would go to the Euros maybe next year, whether you keep your ticket or whether you'd give it away, how comfortable you feel, and how can we, as a global society, manage that fear. The other thing it tells us, which I think is probably important in relation to the Tokyo Olympics and the planned postponement of that at the moment, not a cancellation, but a postponement at the moment. Women's World Cup was relocated to the US from China in 2003 as a result of SARS, and as a result was far less spectacular than it had been in 1999. It was basically, the matches that I attended were like in a little five-a-side facility next to the local B&Q, whereas in 1999 we'd been in the Rose Bowl with 93,000 fans. So the whole image of this tournament was tarnished, and I think this is one of the things that the Tokyo Olympics is going to have to consider. We can learn that it's unwise to try and stage a mega event in rush conditions, better to postpone and consider options, possibly cancel and possibly to rebrand. And again, I'd be interested to know people's thoughts on that. So what role can sport play, what's left of it at times of crisis like these? Well, one of the things that sport's always been really good at, and I think with the reshowing of the 1966 World Cup on TV, is that it provides moments of national communion. Although, having said that, those moments of national communion where we all sit and watch the same thing and experience it at the same time have become increasingly fractured as people either experience it via social media or stream it at their own convenience and therefore don't necessarily watch the event live as it was. I think we've learned that there are certain sports that this situation has been good for. Golf, tennis, motor racing, because of the fire retardant aspects of the safety rules in motor racing, they are virtually wearing PPE. So as an unintended consequence of the rule changes within that sport, they're able to host the events. And of course, horse racing, although it's been less spectacular. And again, I think we could maybe see the motivation for things like horse racing returning because of the links with other industries, such as gambling. So the gambling industry and the gaming industry has certainly also had a knock-on effect, as has the media industry. It's been bad for local leisure centres and local provision. And we still don't know, with plans for example, socially distanced swim, and what the knock-on effects are going to be on that, especially for excluded groups who already find it difficult to access these kinds of centres, and the provision that might need to be in place for them. Huge lessons, I think, to be learned from e-games. And so, for instance, the number of young motor racing F1 drivers who currently use simulators to find ways of improving their skills to get around circuits has translated to the fact that you can watch Charles Leclerc take on any of the other drivers in the e-games, and so it's more able to show an audience that is socially distanced and virtual. So might there be lessons from e-games? And I think also generational differences. Certainly I know most of the people at my local gym are my age or older, and many of them live in flats or accommodation with assisted living. So coming to the gym, they tend to spend the whole day there. They will swim, they'll do their yoga, they'll use the tennis courts, they'll do the weights or whatever, but they're there also to have a coffee and to socialise and for the mental health benefits. And I think we've got to be really mindful of the generational differences in the provision that we pick up. A big question that's facing us all is we live in a much more connected world now. How does this impact on global sport in terms of the way this particular pandemic is hitting sport's relationship with spectators? And one of the things that I am using Manchester City to show here is that the crowd is an integral part of the spectacle. As we've seen with the football games that have been played without crowds, there's just, to say there's no atmosphere is an obvious thing, but you just don't get that reaction to the spontaneous nature of sport. I don't think we can plead, by the way, for special measures for sport, because people are missing their theatre and their concerts and their entertainments just as they are sport. So I don't think there's a special case to be made for sport. And neither do I think, that there are particular health benefits related to spectator sport. After all, most of us, when we are watching people who are good enough to be paid to play sport, those of us who are not good enough to be paid to play sport are often sitting, drinking something fizzy and eating something salty and, sitting down to do so. So spectatorship in itself is not particularly healthy, but it is integral to the way that sport is done. So how can we get back to that, and what will the solutions to that be? And then just to contrast that slide with the an empty slide at Leicester City, I have to say this was taken after a match, by the way, not a reflection at all, of course, on the mighty Leicester City, but it reflects how little atmosphere there is without that crowd visibly reacting to the action. And it's not just the fans who can make it into the stadium. One of the things that I think is really interesting about a global fan base for sport is that Leicester City people who make it out of Leicester and, go off and be successful elsewhere in the world will form Leicester City supporters clubs in, I've met them all over the world. So how do you keep in touch with those fans? And how do you connect with them, and how do you continue to make big business out of your global fan base? What are the opportunities? Are the opportunities mainly going to be digital? Now, I know in drawing this to a close, this all feels a little bit gloomy, but I don't want to end on a gloomy note. As you'll probably, if you follow me on social media, you'll know that when I finally had to hang up my boots at the age of 40, when they'd asked me to become a player manager, which is always a sign really that the players want you to move on, but keep you involved in some way in the club. So I had to pack in my football, and I took up a variety of challenges, and one of those is London Marathon, Great North Run, yada, 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 Great North Swim, and I had to go at a couple of triathlons last year. So I've been out doing my regulation activity, but as much of it as I can possibly do, mainly for the mental health benefits, as the physical benefits. And I've found that there are lots of people out cycling and walking, and you can tell that they don't do this or haven't done this an awful lot before. And it strikes me that more people are out cycling and running and walking, and quite a few people I know have even set themselves pandemic health challenges. A guy I know is is trying to do 100 sit-ups, 100 press-ups and 100 burpees throughout the whole of June to raise money for dementia charities. So have I focused in this lecture too much on sport? And should I have been focusing more on the opportunities from this pandemic, on our relationship, on society's relationship with physical activity? After all, large parts of our city during lockdown and large parts of our countryside have enabled us to get out. And because we've all not been commuting as much as we normally would, we've had the time to get out and to do more physical activity, benefiting our mental health and physical health. So could we be seeing a broader change in society where this pandemic has actually made us, by doing lockdown, focus more on taking responsibility for our personal health? So maybe it is time to get the bike out of storage.
Thank you very much, Jean. That was really interesting. We've got a question here from one of the audience, Mary Mahoney, and she's asking, what are the likely changes post-lockdown in terms of participation, or will it all go back to the old normal? What can we learn from the past?
One of the things that I think is going to be challenging is that most British sport has developed, and I'm thinking at the local community level here, I'm thinking of your little local football club, gymnastic club, swimming club, that sort of thing. Most of that relies on the voluntaristic activity of, you know, mums, dads, relatives, so on and so forth. And we're going to have to think about ways in which we can continue that under social distancing. And I think Judy Murray's been on the news tonight actually saying how tennis has managed to benefit from that, certainly by people playing singles matches. But of course, tennis, to take up a tennis court for 2 people is using a rather large resource for few people. So what we have to think about, and again, I'm thinking in terms of PE at school, we're going to have to change the way in which we do things to facilitate those kinds of activities. And historically, with the selling off of school playing fields on schools when they became in charge of their own budgets, the amount of space at schools for these kinds of activities is really, really limited. So what I am hoping that will change is obviously that we can get back to those voluntary activities, but we use the resources that we have to maximum benefit for the widest range of people within society.
Thank you very much, Jean, and thank you to Mary for the question.
Could I ask, because I can see that there are people, I know that there are people on the call who are more rugby centric. I'm a bit football centric, I'm afraid. Mm-hmm. I know that there are people on the call who are more rugby centric, and maybe they have particular concerns because of course, to some extent, football can be socially distanced. But I'm thinking of the communities that are very integral to, you know, rugby league, and to some extent rugby union, about maybe the challenges that those particular sports and those communities would have.
Jean, it's Mary again.
Hi there.
Hi. It just strikes me that one of the biggest challenges here is that there is no pre-testing of players, or no, there doesn't seem to be any kind of infrastructure that would allow full contact sport to play. Surely rugby doesn't need to be operating in such a restricted way, because snooker's just locked everybody in a hotel and they've tested everybody, and they've been on television for 2 weeks, able to participate in the sport. They didn't have an audience and they had to socially distance, but I just feel like we're not really making use of any of the technological opportunities to increase sports activities, particularly at the elite level, for the general public to participate in, because there's such an appetite for watching sport.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Mary, and this is where I think we can see that sport, and again, this is part of its much longer history, but sport is being classified here as part of the entertainment industry, and therefore, you know, in the same ways that I suppose we could argue that everybody going to see what you know, if we went into theatres and we sat, you had half an audience and we sat 2 meters apart, that everybody there could be tested. It is almost like the sport and entertainment industry are being treated very much as luxuries. And I agree with you, it's a real success story. If you look at the Premiership as a product, and if you look at you know, the rugby leagues and motor racing and so on and so forth, these are global products that we have, and you do think that maybe more should be done to help these industries get back on track.
Yes, thank you, Jean. And following on from that, Gary Shaw says, and it's a similar sort of question, what do you think the impact will be on the so-called morale of the nation, assuming we all agree sport plays an important role here, if the main sports in the country cannot resume as normal for an extended period due to spectator restrictions, football, rugby, cricket, etc. So carrying on that discussion. Yeah, and I'm just looking at Gary's second question. Do we just learn to watch, absorb it in a different way? Or does this risk losing spectators in large numbers? If I could speak to that point, Gary, this is what I think I'm flagging up with the success of esports. Because, and again, Gary and I know one another, we go years back, so he'll know as much as I do that when most football grounds are now redeveloped, and theorists have started to call them tradiums rather than stadiums, so you know, they're more like out of town shopping malls. The redevelopment of those football stadia often involves an e-gaming suite for young people who will not watch the match. They don't go into that e-gaming suite to actually watch the match that will be hosted on that day. They are playing quite different games for quite different constituent audiences, and they've got their own fans. So much so that most Premiership football clubs will have ambassadors who are very good at the various e-games, FIFA or whatever, because already younger consumers are consuming sport in quite different ways than you know, than older consumers. They don't like this national moment of communion anymore, and they want to consume stuff when and how they want to consume it. So I think we can learn an awful lot, and again, for those of you who know the work of Andy Meir and Gary Crawford, these theorists have been writing about that an awful lot, and also the extent to which even those of us who are you know, slightly long in the tooth to be using social media are having to learn these multiple ways of consuming sport, and the ways that it enables us to do that. So I do think Gary's thought on that is probably the way in which it's going to go. Having said that, and again, I was talking to Paula a little bit about this before the lecture, we do have to be mindful of people who are digitally excluded. And we do need to allow people to access sport in the broadest number of ways possible. So, yeah, I think we've got to be mindful of that too. Okay, thank you, Jean. And we've got another question from L. Jenkel. What impact do you think the postponement of the Women's European Championship will have on the sport, especially considering the currently growing popularity?
Yeah, very, very concerning, and you won't be surprised. Again, if you follow my work, that we've missed an opportunity already by suspending the Women's Super League this season, whereas we know the Frauen Bundesliga went ahead and has been televised and has got a really good reaction. So that was an opportunity missed. And just to go, do you know what, we're going to finish the Women's Super League season and we'll give Chelsea 100,000 and that's that done. What the hiatus gave us was, if you like, a vacuum. There was loads of dead air time to be able to fill with women's sport potentially, and that didn't happen. So I'm really concerned about the Women's Euros and the postponement, not least because it's now going to take place in 2022, a men's World Cup year. So getting media attention and other forms of attention are problematic. And the only hope that I can find from that is that it gives us more time to think how to stage it thoughtfully. And I know that there are a number of, the FA has appointed a legacy coordinator, which they didn't the last time they hosted the Women's Euros in 2005. And I know that they're doing quite a lot of history work to try to promote the history of the women's game and not to tell this constant story of progress. So I think that although I'm cautiously optimistic, there are some real opportunities there.
Just while we're waiting, just if there's anybody else who does want to comment, just to say that we're continuing with the lectures next week, and we've got Dr. Gavin Ward, who works alongside Jean, talking about compulsory exercise in school, pupil and teacher eye views, and that's at the same time next week, Tuesday the 23rd of June. We've then got a sort of change of tack, and we've got some arts and culture and well-being lectures on witchcraft, voodoo, fake news, and well-being. So if anybody likes the sound of any of those, obviously please look at University Centre Telford Facebook page or the University of Wolverhampton virtual events page. Now I think somebody's just posted something. Just a comment from Mary Mahoney saying thank you very much for a really interesting and thought-provoking lecture. So I would echo that, Jean, if anybody else.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Paula.
Yes. Thank you ever so much. That was really interesting and really thought-provoking, and hopefully offers some positivity really for the future. As you say, some of it sounds gloomy, but at least if we think about how we can adapt and how sport can adapt, then it gives us something positive to take from it all. Let me just check if there's anything else. Yes, Gary Shaw, many thanks. Enjoyed it very much. So thank you very much to everybody who's joined us and to everybody who's asked a question. And above all, thank you very much to Jean for the lecture tonight, which was really very inspiring and thought-provoking. Thanks very much, Jean.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Thanks for attending.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.